This is a homily for the 27th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading is from the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verses 18 to 24. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 10, verses 2 to 16. We are still with Jesus and the disciples on the way to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast of Passover. The setting of today's Gospel is the territory of Judea and Transjordan. As we'll see in a minute, the setting is important because the Transjordan region, known as Perea, was under the control of Herod Antipas. As we've seen over the past few weeks, this geographical journey from north to south is also about an inner journey, the journey of discipleship. Last Sunday, we reflected upon some of the key lessons of discipleship in Mark's Gospel. We must renounce self, take up the cross, and follow Jesus. We must lose our life for the sake of Jesus and the gospel. We must become servant of all and welcome the powerless. We also heard some harsh and uncompromising sayings. Cut off your hand or your foot, and pluck out your eye if it should cause you to stumble. Our commitment to life in God's kingdom must override anything that would jeopardize it. In today's Gospel, Jesus again welcomes little children, saying that it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. So the kingdom of God must be welcomed and received with innocence, openness, and trust, the way that little children receive everything they need. But because children, in the eyes of society at that time, were considered to be insignificant, weak, and dependent, they are reminders to the disciples that they must be especially welcoming to those who are insignificant, weak, and dependent. The lesson on discipleship continues this week as Jesus responds to a question about marriage. Some Pharisees approach Jesus and ask, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" This is an odd question to ask, given that all first-century Jewish groups known to us permitted divorce. Divorce was not a contested issue. The Torah makes it quite clear that divorce was permissible. In chapter 24 of the book of Deuteronomy we read, "Suppose a man has taken a woman and made her his wife, but she has not pleased him, and he has found something objectionable of which to accuse her. He has therefore made out a writ of divorce for her and handed it to her, and then dismissed her from his house. She leaves his home and goes away to become the wife of another man." Note the grounds for divorce. The wife has not pleased her husband, and he has found something objectionable of which to accuse her. The Jewish historian Josephus, who was writing at the same time that the Gospels were being written, tells us this about divorce in first-century Palestine. In Book 4 of the Antiquities of the Jews, he writes, "He that desires to be divorced from his wife for any cause whatever, and many such causes happen among men, let him in writing give assurance that he will never use her as his wife any more. For by this means she may be at liberty to marry another husband, although before this bill of divorce be given, she is not permitted to do so." Three things are clear from this. Firstly, only the husband was able to initiate divorce proceedings. Secondly, the husband gives his wife a writ of dismissal or a bill of divorce. And thirdly, the wife is not free to remarry unless she has this writ of dismissal. An example of such a writ of dismissal was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls from Murabat, close by the western shore of the Dead Sea. It reads, "I divorce and repudiate of my own free will, I, Joseph, son of Nachsan, you, my wife Miriam, so that you are free on your part to go and become a wife of any Jewish man that you please." No group within Judaism prohibited divorce. However, the rabbis argued among themselves about the grounds for divorce. How displeased did the husband have to be before he could divorce his wife? How objectionable did the wife's conduct have to be to justify divorce? Two famous rabbis living at the time of Jesus had differing views, Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai. According to the Mishnah, the school of Shammai interpreted this text very strictly. Unless the wife was guilty of adultery, there could be no divorce. However, the school of Hillel gave a very liberal interpretation of the various ways in which a wife might displease her husband. So, for example, if the wife spoilt a dish of food, if she spoke to a strange man, if she spoke disrespectfully of her husband's relatives in his hearing, if she was a brawling woman. Human nature being what it is, the laxer view prevailed. The result was that divorce, for the most trivial reasons, or for no reason at all, was tragically common. If this controversy was behind the Pharisees' question, Jesus doesn't endorse one side or the other. Rather, he asks the question, "What did Moses command you?" And the Pharisees answer, "Moses allowed us to draw up a writ of dismissal and so to divorce." Note, by the way, that Mark tells us that the Pharisees were asking this question to test Jesus. The Greek word used here is perazontes, which means literally trying to trap. If the right of a Jewish man to divorce his wife wasn't a contested matter, in what way is this question a trap? There is something more sinister afoot here. Today's Gospel comes from chapter 10, but let's go back a few chapters. Let's go back to chapter 6, and there we read about the fate of John the Baptist once he had confronted Herod about marrying his brother's wife Herodias. This Herod, known as Herod Antipas, was a son of Herod the Great. After the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC, the Romans divided his kingdom into 4. The Romans assumed control of Judea, and at the time of Jesus, Pontius Pilate was the governor. The Herod we're interested in here, a son of Herod the Great, was Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. He was known as a tetrarch because he ruled a quarter of his father's kingdom. The other person we're interested in is Herod Philip, tetrarch of Trachonitis. He also was a son of Herod the Great, but by a different mother. Herod Philip was married to his niece, Herodias, and they had a daughter named Salome. Herodias divorced Herod Philip so that she could marry Herod Antipas, who was Philip's half-brother, and he also was her uncle. Herodias seems to have had a thing for uncles and men named Herod. The Herodian family tree is incredibly complicated. John the Baptist confronted Antipas, telling him that it was not lawful for him to marry his brother's wife. Antipas had John imprisoned. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that the Baptist was imprisoned within the fortress of Machaerus, to the east of the Dead Sea. Machaerus was located within the tetrarchy of Herod Antipas. Mark tells us the story of John the Baptist's fate in chapter 6. On the occasion of his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. Herodias' daughter Salome danced for Herod and his guests, and so pleased Herod that he said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it." Salome asks her mother what she should ask for, and Herodias, who was furious at John's denunciation of her marriage to Herod, said to her daughter, "Ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And so John was beheaded in prison. It is more than likely that the Pharisees who are questioning Jesus about divorce had this episode in mind. If John was beheaded for commenting on Herod's marital arrangements, the Pharisees may well have hoped that the same fate would await Jesus if they could get him to say publicly that divorce is contrary to the law. Keep in mind the setting of today's gospel, the territory of Judea, which is directly under Roman control, but also the territory of Transjordan, which is under the control of Herod Antipas. So when the Pharisees tell Jesus that Moses allowed us to draw up a writ of dismissal and so to divorce, he replies, "It was in view of your hardness of heart that he wrote this commandment for you." The Greek word that Mark uses is sklerokardia, which is made up of skleros, which means hard, and kardia, which means heart. The Greek word sklerokardia therefore refers to perversity or stubbornness, to a lack of spiritual perception. Jesus then goes on to say, "But from the beginning of creation he made them male and female. This is why a man will leave his father and mother, and the two become one flesh. They are no longer two, therefore, but one flesh. So then, what God has united, no one may separate." Jesus here is alluding to the stories of creation in the book of Genesis. As we'll see in a moment, there are two stories of creation in the book of Genesis. When Jesus says that God made them male and female, he's alluding to what we find in the first of the two creation stories in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. We read there, "God created man in the image of himself. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." When Jesus says that the man and the woman are no longer two, therefore, but one flesh, he is alluding to a verse in the second creation story, Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. We read there, "This is why a man leaves his father and mother and becomes attached to his wife, and the two become one flesh." Jesus then declares, "What God has united, no one may separate." Paul, writing at least 10 years earlier than Mark's Gospel, confirms what Jesus has just said. He writes this to the Corinthians, "To the married I give this ruling, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not be separated from her husband, and a husband should not divorce his wife." Paul adds his own pastoral instructions that if the wife is separated, she should remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Jesus contravenes Deuteronomy's granting of divorce by appealing to the account of creation in the book of Genesis. This explains the choice of today's first reading from the book of Genesis. Genesis begins with not one, but two very different stories of creation, placed side by side in chapters 1 and 2. As we've just seen, Jesus alludes to both of these creation stories in what he says in today's Gospel. People in the ancient world certainly didn't have the scientific understanding of the world that we now have, but they were not fools. They realized that these two stories were incompatible with each other if they were to be interpreted literally as eyewitness accounts. But the ancient Israelites had no problem with placing two quite different stories side by side, because they understood that they were not intended to be eyewitness or scientific accounts of creation. They are rather theological reflections on the meaning of God's act of creation. Before we have a closer look at the second account of creation, let's spend a few moments looking at the first account of creation. In Genesis chapter 1 verse 3 we read, "The earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters." God then says, "Let there be." Notice that God creates by the power of his word, a single word in the Hebrew text, yehi, and in the Greek text as well, genetheto. There is another important point to keep in mind as we read Genesis chapter 1. Creation is described in terms of its function. So, for example, Genesis 1 is not interested in the sun as a burning ball of gas, or indeed by any of its physical properties. The sun is described in terms of the way that it functions for humanity and human society. On day 1, God says, "Let there be light." God separates the period of light from the period of darkness. These distinct periods are called day and night. In other words, we have the creation of time. On day 2, God says, "Let there be a dome to divide the waters in two." Here we need to understand how the ancients perceived the cosmos. If water comes down from the sky, there must be water up there. If it doesn't come down all the time, then there must be something holding the water back. They therefore thought of a dome or a firmament. When God creates the dome, he is creating space. On day 3, God says, "Let there be dry land and vegetation." God has now created a habitat for the animals and human beings. On the first 3 days, God creates realms or domains. He creates time, space, and habitat. God will now populate these realms or domains. On day 4, God said, "Let there be sun, moon, and stars." On day 5, God said, "Let there be water creatures and birds." And on day 6, God said, "Let there be animals and humans." So the 3 realms or domains are now inhabited. Day 7 is a little mystifying because in this account of creation, nothing is created. We're simply told that having completed the work of creation, God rested on the 7th day. However, a reader in the ancient world would have understood immediately what is happening at this point of the story. This first account of creation is about building a temple. The book of Genesis describes the Garden of Eden as a primordial temple. with Adam as its priest and guardian. Once the temple of creation has been completed, God takes up residence. He rests in the temple he has created. In Psalm 132, for example, we read, "For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling. This is my resting place from age to age. Here have I chosen to dwell." The temple of creation was the dwelling place of God among his people, foreshadowing the divine presence in the tent of meeting and eventually in the Jerusalem temple. Old Testament scholar John Walton explains, "The role of the temple in the ancient world is not primarily a place for people to gather in worship, like modern churches. It is a place for the deity, sacred space. It is his home, but more importantly, his headquarters, the control room. When the deity rests in the temple, it means that he is taking command, that he is mounting his throne to assume his rightful place and his proper role." The first account of creation could be likened to a liturgical procession. The one who comes last in the liturgical procession is the one who presides over the worship that is about to take place, the priest or bishop. Human beings come at the end of the liturgical procession of creation. They are therefore the ones who are to preside over the worship that will be offered in this temple of creation. In chapter 1, verse 27, we read, "And God created the human in his image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." So human beings are created in God's image, tselem in the Hebrew and icon in the Greek. The vocation of humans is to be icons of God. Paul takes up this idea in his letter to the Ephesians. He quotes from Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, and goes on to say that this is a great mystery, and I am applying it to Christ and the church. If the man and woman are icons of God himself, this means that their love for each other gives us an insight into the love that Christ has for his church. And conversely, the love of Christ for his church becomes the exemplar par excellence of the love of a husband for his wife, and a wife for her husband. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says this: "Since God created him man and woman, their mutual love becomes an image of the absolute and unfailing love with which God loves man." When two Christians marry, they not only receive a sacrament, they become one. They become an icon for the world, and above all for their own children, of the love between Christ and his church. The first story of creation makes an important point, and Jesus alludes to it in today's Gospel. The creation of man and woman, of husband and wife, is the climax of God's work as creator. This is in stark contrast to the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish. Keep in mind, there is no text without context. The book of Genesis, as we now have it, was more or less completed by some time in the 6th or 5th centuries BC, at a time when Babylon was the superpower in the region, or perhaps just after Babylon was conquered by the Persians. Many Jews, especially those who had been in exile in Babylon, would have been familiar with the Enuma Elish and its account of how the world came into being. Genesis tells quite a different story. The Enuma Elish begins with two primeval realities, Apsu, the god of the fresh water, and Tiamat, the goddess of the salt waters. From their union, the first generation of gods is born. As subsequent generations of gods are born, their noisy gatherings disturb Apsu. So, despite Tiamat's objections, Apsu decides to kill the younger gods. They, however, learn of the plan and kill Apsu. Tiamat is enraged, and she then decides to kill the younger gods, and they are powerless to stop her. However, one of the youngest of the gods, Marduk, the god of the storm, proposed that he would defeat Tiamat on condition that he be given supreme power among the gods. Marduk slays Tiamat and forms the world from her dead corpse, slicing it in two to make the earth and the sky. Marduk reigns supreme. He then slays Kingu, Tiamat's ally, and from his blood creates human beings. But human beings are created to be slaves to the gods, performing whatever menial tasks are assigned to them. In the Enuma Elish, the world emerged out of primeval violence, and humans are slaves, bound to a miserable existence, subject to divine figures who have no real interest in them. This is in stark contrast to the creation stories that we have in the book of Genesis. In Genesis, God alone is the creator of the heavens and the earth. There are no other gods. God therefore creates without conflict with any competing gods. In peace and with supreme authority, God speaks, and the elements of the cosmos come into existence. Let's now turn to the second creation story in Genesis. We read that water came up from the ground and watered all the face of the earth. So we begin with mud. God then shapes man from the dust of the ground and breathed the breath of life into his nostrils, and the man became a living being. Here we have a typical Hebrew pun. The Hebrew word for human is Adam, and the word for ground is Adamah. In other words, humans are formed from the soil. It's interesting to note that our English word human comes from the Latin word humus, which means soil or earth. This takes us back to the second story in Genesis, where the first human is formed by God from the soil of the earth. God then creates a garden for the man. Note, by the way, that at this stage of the story, God has created only one creature, the man. God then puts the man to work to cultivate the garden and take care of it. But as you might expect, the man is lonely. After all, there is not a single living creature apart from him, not even a mosquito. So God creates the animals and parades them past the man. The animals were created to be companions for the man. He names them, which means, in biblical thought, that he has dominion over the creatures that he names. But as the animals pass before him, there is not one of them that really captures his heart. So God puts the man into a deep sleep, and while he sleeps, God takes a rib from the side of the man, and from the rib he creates woman. When the man awakes from sleep, he is delighted. This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." Did the ancients think this was how God created man and woman? Of course not. They knew as well as us that this story was a theological reflection on the meaning of creation and of the relationship between the man and the woman, the husband and his wife. You see, once a rib had been taken from the side of the man, he was no longer whole or complete. When does he become whole and complete again? When he and the woman become one. Not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, psychologically. For the man and the woman, the path to wholeness and fulfillment is not in isolation or in solitude, but in communion with each other. For Jesus, the situation that prevailed from the beginning of the creation reflects God's will. This is the full ideal of marriage. This is God's plan in all its grandeur.